Hey everybody, welcome back to Coral Reefs. Today I want to talk about basic coral reef fundamentals. I want to talk about the type of ecosystem it is, how the ecosystem interacts in different sorts of very simple examples, and I want to talk about how these animals and the plants that live on the coral reefs make up what's a very complex and interconnected ecosystem that is probably going to help save us from climate change. Coral reefs are a very complex ecosystem of plants and animals. They represent some 2 million different species exist on these rainforests of the ocean. Some sources say that's up to 25% of marine life on the planet. Now, to me, it wasn't clear if that was 20% by volume or by weight, or that 1 out of every 4 species found in the oceans lives in coral reefs, but that's something we can look up. I actually tried to find a paper of it that cited that reference, and it wasn't clear to me what that was. The other thing is, over the last 50 years, something like 20% of coral reef area has been lost. It's died. Different types of things are responsible for deaths on the coral reefs. One is coral bleaching, which is responsive to sea surface temperature. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Other ones are invasive species, especially in the Caribbean. And third big effect of coral reefs' health is land use. So back in the 1980s, I went the first time to the Caribbean with my geology class in undergraduate, and when we dove on the coral reef in that area, we saw this amazingly beautiful diversity. It really did look like the rainforest of the ocean. Lots of colors, lots of fish. Everywhere you looked, there was life. I went back 4 or 5 years ago, and boy, it looked like a bomb had hit the reef. The image on the right shows a reef that's been largely dead. Most of the coral animals have died. There's a layer of algae covering everything. You can actually see some living corals and sort of in the upper right-hand corner of that image on the right. But really, something like 10% of the surface area of the seafloor is covered by living organisms now. Living coral organisms. The rest is covered by very much living algae that are taking advantage of the hard substrate that the coral skeletons offer. As I mentioned, one of the causes of this is a recent increase in sea surface temperature. This is a graph that shows how sea surface temperature has increased over the last 50, 60 years. You can see a steady increase from a baseline in that 1950 average of about 0.5 degrees Celsius. That's actually pretty significant when you think about a scale that can be. It's actually pretty significant when you consider how much the temperature varies in this area, how little it varies really, and how that can affect how these animals metabolize food and how they interact with their ecosystem. This is a graph that shows a similar data set. This is actually just in the Caribbean, where the last one was in the tropical Atlantic Ocean. This one shows there's actually been a decline since between 2008, 2007, and 2010. But boy, it went right back up in 2011 by up to about 0.6 degrees Celsius above normal. So rising sea surface temperatures are a concern. When that happens, the coral reefs get stressed and they start responding in ways and eventually die. Another stress is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere does two things. Whatever it does, it affects the production of aragonite. Aragonite is one of those calcifying minerals that makes up the skeleton of most coral reefs. This one shows how the amount of calcium available in the water is actually dropped, and the ability for these coral reefs to make calcite pretty much with temperature. So the model here shows how the Caribbean reefs are responding to global changes in temperature and aragonite production also. So if you can't make the skeleton, these animals can't live. Okay, when many of us think about coral reefs, we often think about white sand beaches and palm trees. And well, it's a beautiful thought, but next time you go to the white sand beach, I want you to think about one little thing. That beach is made up of lots of bits of little sand, and you can see in here bits of coral and seashells and long needle-like bits. They're probably parts of broken coral, and it's really quite a beautiful thing when you look at it up close. But a lot of those sort of grayish, light-colored white round grains in this image are fish poo. Our friend the parrotfish is one of the most important animals on the coral reef ecosystem. The job of the parrotfish is to make sure that the health of the reef is maintained by eating algae from the reef. They've adapted this by having a pair of very strong, tough jaws and these razor-like sharp teeth. What they do is they go up to the reef and they kind of nibble on the edge of the reef to make sure that all the algae on the reef is removed in a timely fashion. Here is a very happy parrotfish in a reef covered with algae, and you can see he's so happy he's just making sand. And here's another parrotfish making some sand and depositing it on the seafloor, and a whole massive pile of fish poo. A few years ago, actually back in 1992, a new species came to the Caribbean Ocean. This is the lionfish, which is native to Southeast Asia. As the story goes, in 1992, when Hurricane Andrew hit Florida, it wiped out a house that had this as an ornamental fish in a saltwater tank. And that's how this species got released into the environment. When it got into the environment, it took a very short time for it to become extremely well-traveled in the Caribbean. Now it's found all throughout the Caribbean and the tropical Atlantic, including Bermuda. And because it comes from Southeast Asia, it doesn't have any natural predators. The predators in Southeast Asia adapted to actually eat this guy, despite its extremely toxic spines you can see sticking out from that. The answer, one of the answers to taking care of this fish, which favorite food, of course, is the parrotfish, is to eat it. So a bunch of NGOs and the like have proposed different ways to cook, recipes for cooking lionfish, ways to catch them safely, and how to prepare them so they don't poison the eater. But because the lionfish have been so successful in the Caribbean, they've actually really dramatically affected and reduced the parrotfish population, which means the algae on the reef is going crazy and the coral reef cannot fight, the coral animals cannot fight it off. Let's have a little bit closer look at the coral animals themselves. How do they actually work to fight off these different animals? How do they, different threats, how do they eat? How do they survive in an environment that's constantly changing? Well, coral are a member of the class Cnidaria. Cnidaria are the same class as jellyfish, sea anemones, and hydras. If you look at this medusa stage of a jellyfish, it's very similar to the coral polyp. You just take that medusa stage and flip it upside down, you get basically what looks like the coral animal. If you look at it a little bit closely, this is a very simple organism. It has got one opening, it's just a mouth, and the anus is the same way of bringing in food and expelling waste. The tentacles are armed with what they call nematocysts, which are these stinging cells. So, jellyfish sting, so do corals and anemone. But they can actually move around and reach out and use their nematocysts to capture prey, mostly smaller prey like zooplankton. Remember, these guys are very small. They tend to be kind of that big in scale. The tentacles will stun these different zooplankton and slowly bring them back down into the mouth, where they're digested in a very simple gastrovascular cavity. There's a gastrodermis that's coated with different enzymes which are used to digest the food and use the nutrients from that food to feed and keep the cells of the animal going. Curiously, there's also linkages between different animals in the colony, and there's something called a cenosarc, which connects the different animals, individual animals in the colony, and allows them to actually transfer nutrients between the different animals and keep the whole colony alive. One other thing that's really unique, and this is the thing that gives corals their color, or they call it zooxanthellae. These are symbiotic algae that live actually within the tissue of the coral animal. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. However, one of my most favorite things about coral is that they are reef builders. They make these hard substrates made out of calcium carbonate. That calcium carbonate can take very slightly different forms. Basically, calcite is a mineral that you can find, sometimes aragonite, but these are basically eventually become limestone generically. But this calcium carbonate, CaCO3, is my favorite mineral, and I'll tell you why. Calcium carbonate, because it actually holds on to CO2, is an extraordinary reservoir for carbon dioxide, so it fights global warming. And if you want to understand how the oceans fight, one of the ways the oceans fight global warming, this is how it's done chemically. And we're going to focus on this equation, we're going to see it again, we'll talk about it in class, but it's something I do want you to know. As animals and cars and power plants and boats and airplanes put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that carbon dioxide gets absorbed into seawater. And when it mixes with water, it dissociates water into a hydrogen plus cation plus a carbonic and a carbonic acid, HCO3. So this makes carbon dioxide in the seawater actually makes the seawater a little bit more acidic, where it provides one proton, which increases the acidity or drops the pH a little bit, plus this carbonic acid, which is also further dissociated inside the coral animal. Now the coral animal has ways of dissociating this carbonic acid a little bit further, where it pulls off yet another hydrogen and leaves you with a carbonate anion, the CO3 -2 anion. Well, that anion, the carbonate anion, can actually mix with calcium in the seawater to form calcium carbonate, and that's what makes this substrate of the coral reef. Now remember, the interesting thing about this is once you have that calcium carbonate, the CaCO3, it can be dissociated yet again by acids. So if you have a lot of extra hydrogen ions floating around, it can actually pull off that the carbonic acid from the calcium, increasing the pH or just dissolving the calcium carbonate. So it's a system that's constantly cycling around depending on how much carbonate's involved. Also, different animals metabolize this carbonic acid differently, so some can actually use the extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to make more limestone, where other animals find that carbonic acid can't associate into carbonate quite so well and just keep kicking out hydrogens and making more acidic compounds. Before I mentioned this zooxanthellae, which are pretty remarkable little symbionts that live within the animal structure of the corals. These are what they call mutualistic symbiotic algae that live in the gastrodermis part of the coral, of these hermatypic corals, the corals that make their own land, and they also provide a home for these zooxanthellae. In this image you can actually see these photosynthetic algae that live within the clear-ish arms of the coral animal. The zooxanthellae are remarkable. You remember from photosynthesis that what do you need for photosynthesis? You need water, nutrients, and carbon dioxide. So because the corals are animals, they expel carbon dioxide as part of the respiration, and the zooxanthellae are there to incorporate this, to use the carbon dioxide for its photosynthesis, putting out oxygen, which the animal can then use. Now the really cool thing about this is during times of low food, which happens at different times of the year when there's less nutrients available, the coral polyp, the actual animal, can then use this carbohydrates produced by the photosynthesis of the zooxanthellae as food. So the zooxanthellae are protected by the gastrodermis of the coral polyp, and the coral polyp can actually use this zooxanthellae for food in times of low zooplankton or phytoplankton that's in the water columns. Truly remarkable ecosystem. When the corals get stressed, however, they actually can expel the zooxanthellae. Why that happens, we're not exactly sure. It's something I'd be curious to learn more about. Here's an image of a coral that's been expelled its zooxanthellae, and it turns this very bleach white color, where the other ones around it are still colorful. You can still see that greenish color of the zooxanthellae in the gastrodermis of these different species. Now the white coral in the middle can still be alive. It can still have live coral polyps on them. It's just they've expelled their zooxanthellae. However, they can't live that long without their zooxanthellae. So if it comes down to another time of low food production, they might actually starve and die. And that's what's happening a lot in the Caribbean. Another way that, other than using these zooxanthellae for food, I mentioned these nematocysts. Pretty cool way of doing it. They've got these barbs that are coiled in different cells in the animal. And when they feel a prey is nearby or it's triggered somewhere or another by that little nisodil, I think they pronounce it, it sends out this barb which then injects the prey with a little bit of a neurotoxin and stuns it so the coral can eat it. This is a scanning electron microscope image of these barbs. They really are nasty little things that stick in the animal and really they can't get away. Corals have one of the more remarkable ways of reproducing themselves also. Once or twice a year, usually on the same night, or at least within the same week, corals spawn, where they often send out these massive, they broadcast eggs, in this case of this image, and sperm at the same time. Really cool thing which I just learned, which I didn't realize before preparing for this lecture, was that different species of coral will expel their eggs and sperm at different times, usually separated by only 1 or 2 days during this 1 week when the temperatures of the ocean are a certain way and the lunar cycle is a certain way. So that way it ensures that there's not much cross-fertilization between species. You won't end up with hybridization because they're able to spawn on different nights. How they know when to spawn, again, another mystery of science. What I'm going to do is show a short video of what the spawning looks like. They can explain it a little bit better than I can. It's truly a beautiful thing, and it's I have to say, it's one of those things I think is on my bucket list to see one of these spawning events somewhere in the oceans when it actually happens. So I'll leave it at that. We'll go to the video in just a second.